My name is Natalie Brooks. I'm 36 and white. I had rehearsed my reaction for weeks, perfecting the balance of humble gratitude and quiet confidence I'd show when they finally announced it. The senior director role I had all but been promised, the role I had worked toward for nearly 7 years, through weekends spent on strategy decks, last-minute flights to salvage client relationships, and endless meetings where I did all the talking while someone else collected the credit. I wore my best navy blazer that morning, not because I expected fanfare, but because I wanted to mark the moment with a small personal celebration, something to look back on and remember I had looked like I belonged at the top. The morning dragged as we waited for the all-hands meeting, the kind that usually meant someone was getting promoted and everyone else had to clap like it didn't sting. When my name wasn't on the invite, I didn't panic. I just assumed it was a formality they'd correct, but the announcement came anyway, and it wasn't me. Tessa Lane, a woman I had met exactly once in the break room, where she mistook me for someone in HR, was named Director of Client Strategy, the position I had spent a decade earning. She beamed in a photo sent out with the announcement, wearing a power suit 2 sizes too small and a grin so wide it practically shouted nepotism. My inbox lit up within seconds. Peers sending vague apologies, a few brave souls sending stunned gifs, and one Slack message that simply said, "What the fuck?" I sat there frozen, coffee going cold in my hand, unable to process how a woman who had been hired less than 6 months ago to observe and ideate had leapfrogged over every qualified candidate with nothing more than a Pilates friendship with the CEO's wife and an Instagram following of women who worshipped her for her detox smoothie recipes. No one said it outright, but the truth hung in the air like spoiled perfume, nauseating and impossible to ignore. I kept refreshing the email, looking for a second one, a clarification, some acknowledgement that this was temporary or strategic or even accidental, but nothing came. Instead, Tessa strutted past my desk later that afternoon, phone glued to her ear, saying something about onboarding new accounts that had once been mine, clients I had nurtured through recessions, rebrands, and internal chaos. My stomach twisted as I realized she was talking about Carter and Bloom, my largest account, the one I had saved from walking out the door last year. I had spent years learning the nuances of their business, their voice, their expectations, and now she would be their point of contact because she once taught the CEO's wife how to use resistance bands. I sat there smiling, nodding, pretending to be unaffected while every cell in my body screamed. And yet, even then, I knew better than to react. Because when they count you out, you do not beg to be counted. You wait and you watch. And when the time is right, you make them remember who you are. When I finally got the meeting with my manager, Lisa, she acted like the whole thing was just a minor reshuffle. Like I hadn't been carrying the company's top accounts on my back for the past 3 years while training junior staff, smoothing over executive tantrums, and presenting in boardrooms that still looked past me to find a man. She didn't even make eye contact at first, just clicked her pen and stared at her planner like my disappointment was a scheduling inconvenience, not a betrayal. I asked her directly why Tessa had been given the director title, and she smiled with the kind of tight corporate grin that only shows up when someone is preparing to gaslight you. "It's not about titles, Natalie," she said. "It's about evolving roles and company vision." She tossed out words like agile and synergize and next phase like confetti, hoping I'd be too dazzled to notice she was saying absolutely nothing. When I pushed again, her tone sharpened, and she told me the executive team had made a collective decision to redistribute leadership energy across newer voices. That was the moment it clicked. This wasn't about merit, it wasn't about vision, it was about visibility. Tessa was younger, flashier, and knew how to dress her mediocrity in motivational quotes and matcha-colored filters. That afternoon, she posted a photo on LinkedIn of herself, in front of the company logo, hands on hips, with a caption that read, "When women support women, powerful things happen." So grateful to a company that believes in bold new leadership. I stared at the screen, watching her comments fill with flame emojis and girl boss claps from people who had never once stayed late to finish a budget reconciliation or calm down a furious client at midnight. I couldn't bring myself to hit like, not even out of politeness, My inbox stayed silent. No follow-up from Lisa. No clarification from HR. Nothing that even resembled an acknowledgement of what had been done. I went home that night and stood in front of my bathroom mirror, still in my blazer, makeup smudged, wondering if this was what it felt like to be erased while still technically being present. My name was still on the org chart. My badge still opened the door, but somehow, without warning, I had become invisible. And yet, I didn't cry. Not yet. Instead, I opened my laptop and started pulling receipts, email threads, presentation decks, performance reviews, every slide I'd ever created that was now living in Tessa's project folders. I labeled them quietly, methodically, like lining up soldiers for a battle no one else knew was coming. Because if they were going to rewrite the story, I needed to be sure I had the original manuscript. I wasn't going to yell or rant or storm out. I was going to watch, and I was going to wait. And when the cracks started showing, and they always do, I'd be ready to let the truth slip through every single one. The first sign that things were unraveling came quietly, like a hairline crack in a glass you only notice once it leaks. On a rainy Tuesday morning, I opened my inbox to find a message from Vanessa Patel, the lead marketing executive at Lark & Thorn, one of my legacy clients, the kind of client that required not just strategy but intuition, the ability to sense a pivot before it arrived, to know their tone before they did. The subject line was simple, just checking in, but the body of the email made my chest tighten. It was clearly written with hesitation, a tightrope between confusion and diplomacy. Vanessa asked if I was still involved with their spring campaign, then followed up by saying they had received an initial concept deck from Tessa that felt, in her words, wildly off-brand and alarmingly superficial. She had meant to email Tessa directly, but muscle memory or something more subconscious had led her to me instead. I reread the email 3 times, each sentence landing like a slow drip of ice water down my spine. I hadn't told any clients about the change because I hadn't been given any official messaging. No script from leadership, not even a forwarded memo. I had just been quietly moved aside, my name removed from meetings and email threads like I'd died suddenly, and HR was still figuring out what to do with my belongings. That same afternoon, I got another email, this time from Mitchell at Polaris Brands, another client I had brought in from nothing, someone I had walked through 3 failed rebranding attempts and a global product recall. He simply asked, "Are you on sabbatical? We were told someone else would be leading our account, but she seems very new." I didn't answer right away, partly because I didn't trust myself not to respond with something sharp, but mostly because I didn't know what to say. What was the professional way to say, "I've been replaced by a woman who thinks ROI stands for something inspirational"? Tessa had started inserting herself into client communications with all the grace of a motivational poster taped over a crack in the wall. She used phrases like reimagine the narrative and data is just a story with numbers without realizing she was talking to people who spent their lives managing risk and market share. And the clients were noticing. Slowly at first, a question here, a CC there, then a few calls I wasn't even on, where my name still came up. The silence I had been told to keep was starting to echo louder than anything I could have said. I documented each instance, flagged emails, took notes. Not out of spite, but out of self-preservation. I had spent 10 years building trust, and now someone was bulldozing through it in platform heels and buzzwords. And while I said nothing, my clients were beginning to speak for me. They could smell the difference between real expertise and packaged confidence, and they were not impressed. It started small, almost like static in the background. A few careless changes in a deck I wasn't supposed to be looking at anymore. But there it was, still in my inbox because someone had forgotten to remove me from the thread. The Hawkins campaign had been my baby for 6 straight months, built on real data, careful projections, and messaging that aligned with the client's brand values to the letter. Now it looked like a mood board, slapped together with stock images and phrases that sounded like they'd been pulled from a yoga retreat flyer. The timeline was wrong, the goals were vague, and somehow my name was still attached to the final slide. I didn't respond. I didn't dare. I just saved it, quietly. 2 days later, another email came through, this time regarding Lark & Thorn. The thread included me again, maybe out of habit, maybe because some part of the team still saw me as the one holding it all together. I opened the attached deck and felt the same tightness in my chest. Tessa had proposed an activation on the West Coast, even though the client specifically wanted to target New York. She referenced an influencer who had been publicly dropped by 3 brands last month and framed the entire concept around aesthetics, completely missing the client's push toward substance and long-term brand trust. The kicker? My name, again, right there in the metadata. It was as if I was still in the room, only now I was being credited for everything I never would have approved. Meetings happened without me, but my name kept showing up in footers, on recap emails, in conversations where confused junior staff kept asking if I had signed off on something that made no sense. I said nothing. I just kept collecting. Every off-brand campaign, every mistimed rollout plan, every instance where Tessa called a core product low sex appeal, or suggested we make a rebrand more millennial pink for a tech client that had built its reputation on grayscale sophistication. I watched as people around her nodded, smiled, agreed, afraid to look like they weren't with the times. I knew what they were doing. I had seen it before. When something works, they praise the new face. When it falls apart, they reach back to whoever touched it last and ask questions with knives tucked behind their teeth. I wasn't going to be the scapegoat. So I created a folder, labeled it clearly, and backed it up to 2 locations. I didn't rant, didn't correct her in public, didn't break my silence. Because silence, when used well, is a scalpel. And I was going to wait until the moment they turned toward me, with doubt in their eyes and disappointment on their lips. Then I would let the silence split wide open, and everything they had ignored would be waiting, perfectly organized, ready to speak for itself. I waited until I had enough. Not just a few emails or messy decks, but a timeline, a pattern, something no one could shrug off as miscommunication or personal bias. I scheduled the meeting with HR on a Wednesday afternoon when the office was quiet and the hallways had that post-lunch lull where everyone moved a little slower, heads down. I came in prepared, calm, the way you do when you have truth on your side and think that should be enough. I brought a folder with printed documentation, color-coded tabs, screen captures, even timestamps showing when Tessa submitted files and when the edits had been rolled back by desperate junior staff trying to avoid disaster. The HR rep, a woman named Joanne who once complimented me on my shoes in the elevator and never spoke to me again, smiled like this was just another routine check-in. I started from the beginning, not bitter, not angry, just clear. I explained how client strategies had been misrepresented, how my name continued to be used without my involvement, how the integrity of entire campaigns was slipping through the cracks while the company kept clapping for Tessa's so-called innovation. Joanne listened with that tight-lipped expression people use when they are already crafting their response and just waiting for you to stop talking. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and said, "Thank you for bringing this forward, but we encourage all employees to focus on the future and avoid unnecessary friction." I stared at her, thinking maybe I had misheard. She picked up her pen and added, "It's important to give new team members room to grow, even if their style is different from yours." When I tried to explain that this wasn't about style, that it was about clients losing trust and deliverables being compromised, she gently but firmly warned me that continued behavior like this could be interpreted as undermining a colleague, which could fall under misconduct. Misconduct. That word hit like a slap. I had built this place up with my bare hands, stayed late more nights than I could count, mentored staff who now led departments, and I was being told that protecting the company's reputation might make me a liability. I walked out of that office dizzy, with something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not hurt or betrayed exactly, but insulted. They weren't even pretending to care. The message was loud and clear. Tessa's rise was untouchable, and any resistance to it would be framed as jealousy, bitterness. They didn't want accountability. They wanted silence, wrapped in a smile. I threw the folder in the bottom drawer of my desk, locked it, and sat back down at my computer like nothing had happened. But inside, something shifted. If they thought I was bitter now, they had no idea what patience and precision looked like. I wasn't going to fight them with emotion. I was going to let their own decisions bury them. All I had to do was stay still and let the cracks widen. I stopped asking questions and started collecting answers, Not the kind that came from HR meetings or manager check-ins, but the kind that lived in inboxes and calendars and Slack threads where people thought no one was really watching. If they wanted to pretend that everything was fine, that Tessa was just finding her footing and I was just being sensitive, then fine, I would play along. I smiled in meetings, nodded when her name was mentioned, even congratulated her when she posted another performative LinkedIn update about leadership and sisterhood and breaking glass ceilings with grace. But behind the scenes, I was building a fortress. Every time she missed a deadline, I flagged it. Every time a client emailed me confused about deliverables they never received, I created a folder. Every time someone on the team messaged me asking for clarification on something she had supposedly approved, I took a screenshot. It became a ritual, almost clinical. Before I went to bed, I reviewed the day's receipts, labeled them by account, and forwarded anything important to a secure folder I had created on a private server, one the company could never access. I started building a timeline, not because I wanted revenge, but because I knew what they would do when this all finally fell apart. They would act surprised. They would say no one could have seen it coming. They would say they trusted her because she seemed confident, because she smiled a lot, because she networked well and made people feel excited even when she was delivering nothing. But I would know better. And I would have proof. The mistakes piled up faster than I expected. A report for Hawkins went out with numbers that didn't match the client's fiscal year. A pitch deck for Larkin Thorne included a product line they had discontinued the previous season. She forgot a meeting with Polaris entirely and blamed her calendar, but I had the email showing she had never accepted the invite. It was never one giant failure, just a collection of small cracks that would eventually split wide open, and I documented every one. What surprised me most was how many people started sending me things unprompted. Little notes like, "Not sure if you saw this," or "Didn't you used to handle this account?" They never said what they really meant, which was, "Please fix it," but they didn't have to. I saved those too. I knew better than to reply. I just let the silence grow louder. There is a power in patience that no one teaches you. There is strength in letting the truth sit and wait until the room is ready to hear it. I wasn't bitter. I wasn't jealous. I was just preparing. Because if no one else was going to protect my work, my reputation, my years of sacrifice, then I would do it myself. And when the collapse came, I would be ready to hand them the story they tried to rewrite, but fully footnoted and timestamped. It was the kind of night the company lived for. A high-profile product launch with polished lighting, curated playlists, signature cocktails named after brand adjectives, and a guest list filled with influencers, execs, and a handful of very expensive clients. I hadn't been invited, of course. I had received the event flyer through a forwarded internal newsletter, just another glossy reminder that I had been pushed out of the picture, even though the brand being celebrated had once sat in my inbox as nothing more than an exploratory email from a junior associate who believed in my ideas. Tessa had taken over the account 3 months earlier, parading it around like a trophy she had earned instead of inherited. That night, I was at home in sweatpants, scrolling through muted Instagram stories of the event, watching her pose under the custom neon signage, all teeth and angles, when my phone rang. I didn't recognize the number, but I answered anyway, and the voice on the other end was clipped, tense, and unmistakably furious. It was Charles Levine, the VP of Brand Strategy for Polaris, one of the most powerful voices in our client portfolio, and the man who had once told me I was the only strategist who ever made him feel heard. He didn't waste time on greetings. He asked me why the main campaign video hadn't played, why the live poll link was broken, and why no one from the team had the correct talking points for the press. For a moment, I just sat there, blinking at the ceiling. I hadn't seen the final run of show, hadn't been looped into logistics, hadn't been asked to double-check anything, but I already knew. I could picture the scene, the frantic whispers, the missing files, the mounting panic beneath Tessa's perfect hair. I could also picture the presentation I had built weeks earlier, the one she had picked apart and rebuilt with fluff and filler. I inhaled slowly and asked Charles to hold for a second. I pulled up the version I had archived and read the rundown aloud to him, step by step, asset by asset, including where everything should have lived, what hashtags were pre-approved, which vendors had been briefed, and which segments were meant to lead into which visuals. He didn't speak for a long time after I finished. Then he muttered, "I knew it," and hung up. I sat there staring at my phone, heart pounding, not because I was nervous, but because I knew that call had not just come out of frustration, it had come out of necessity. And now my name was back in the room. Not as a liability, not as a footnote, but as the only person who had remembered what mattered. I didn't text anyone. I didn't gloat. I just saved the call log and the follow-up message that came an hour later. It simply read, "You should have been here." That was the moment I knew the collapse had started. Not with a bang, but with a missing file and a phone call made out of desperation. The energy in the office the next morning was different, tighter, like the air had thickened overnight and no one could quite breathe the same. It started with a look from the receptionist, then a shift in tone when I passed the design pod, a kind of manufactured casualness that told me people had started whispering about things they were not supposed to say out loud. By the time I got to my desk, I already knew something had broken loose. It didn't take long to confirm it. A forwarded email had landed in my inbox, not from a colleague but directly from Charles Levine's assistant. It was a copy of the formal complaint Polaris had sent to the executive team, outlining the disaster at the launch in blistering detail. Missing creative assets, incorrect brand messaging, logistical confusion, and a failure to deliver on what was promised during contract renewal. At the bottom of the email, in bold, was a warning that if a detailed remediation plan was not provided within 5 business days, they would begin transitioning their business to a competing agency. And there it was, in the CC line, my name. Not Tessa's alone, not just the marketing leads, but mine, as if Charles had reached into the past and pulled me back into the conversation with surgical precision. A moment later, I heard someone say my name down the hall, hushed and clipped, followed by silence. Tessa was nowhere to be seen that morning, her office door shut with the lights off, but the rumors moved quickly. She had blamed the failure on the interns, saying someone had uploaded the wrong version, and that she had trusted the process too much. I wanted to laugh, but there was no humor in any of it. I had trained those interns. I knew how meticulous they were. They would never have submitted a final deck without triple-checking it. But that was Tessa's style, always pointing fingers, always smiling wide enough to distract from where she was aiming the knife. The team started tiptoeing around me, unsure of where I stood, unsure if I was part of the problem or the solution. I kept my head down, answered emails, and stayed quiet. But inside, I felt it turning. For the first time since being pushed out, my name wasn't attached to failure. It was attached to clarity, to experience, to the memory of a client who still knew what competence felt like. That afternoon, a meeting invite popped into my calendar from the CEO's office. No subject, just a time. 15 minutes later, a second message followed. This one from Charles. "Thank you for what you did," it said. Short, simple, no fluff, but it meant everything. The whispers in the break room were no longer just gossip. They were the beginning of recognition. And recognition, when you have been erased for months, is a form of resurrection. I didn't need to make a scene. The truth was speaking for me. All I had to do was let it echo. It happened exactly how I expected it to, not with an apology or an admission, but with a veiled offer dressed up in corporate politeness and vague goodwill. The CEO called me into his office 3 days after the Polaris complaint and greeted me like we were old friends, like I hadn't spent the last year being slowly erased under his watch. His assistant brought in coffee I didn't ask for, and he gestured to the chair across from him like I hadn't already sat in it dozens of times during far more consequential meetings. He started with small talk, asking how I was doing, how things were going, if I had any fun plans for the weekend, all while smiling too hard, the kind of smile that signals you're about to be handled. Then came the offer, carefully worded, obviously rehearsed. He told me the leadership team had been discussing some new strategic roles, ones that would give experienced employees like me more room to lead without the pressure of client-facing responsibilities. It would be a lateral move, technically, but with a significant raise and a more flexible schedule. I listened, nodded, even tilted my head like I was thinking about it, but I knew what it was. A consolation prize, a hush check, a neatly folded rug under which they hoped to sweep months of incompetence, gaslighting, and betrayal. The role was nothing more than a padded cell where they could keep me contained, quiet, and removed from the spotlight, now beginning to swing back in my direction. When he asked what I thought, I simply said, "I appreciate the offer, and I'll take some time to consider it." Then I stood, shook his hand, and walked out without saying another word. No one followed up, no one chased me down. They had made their offer, and in their minds, they had done enough. But what they didn't realize was that silence, in moments like this, can carry more weight than outrage. I went back to my desk and resumed my work like nothing had happened, but the office around me had shifted. People noticed I hadn't taken the new role. They noticed I hadn't said thank you or posted a glowing update on LinkedIn or started packing my things for a new office with a fake title. And in that absence, people started talking. I became the name people whispered when they passed by the glass walls of the conference room. I became the cautionary tale that refused to stay buried. Every meeting I was excluded from, every email I was left off, now felt like a risk rather than an oversight. My silence became a question mark no one wanted to answer, a mirror no one wanted to look into. I didn't raise my voice, didn't write a manifesto, didn't storm out with a speech. I simply stayed exactly where I was, steady and quiet, like the tide pulling back before a wave. And they all knew something was coming. They just didn't know when. The email came in at 7:42 a.m., right as I was pouring my second cup of coffee in the office kitchen, and the subject line was so simple it nearly didn't register. Request for alignment. But when I saw the senders, my heart paused for a beat. It wasn't from one client, it was from three, and not just any three, but the backbone of our entire portfolio. The accounts that paid the bills and funded the flashy passion projects that everyone liked to talk about in meetings. Lark and Thorne, Polaris, and Hawkins had coordinated a joint video call request for that afternoon. The body of the email was polite but unmistakably firm. They wanted a discussion about continuity, clarity, and performance. They asked specifically for me to attend. They did not mention Tessa. They did not ask for her. In fact, her name was absent entirely, and that silence said everything. I forwarded the email to the CEO and his assistant without commentary, then waited. I expected some maneuvering, maybe an attempt to reschedule or dilute the invite list, but the reply came back almost immediately. Approved. Meeting link to follow. The speed of it told me everything. They were scared now, not of me, but of the clients. Because when clients start banding together and making demands, it's not just noise, it's a signal, and the higher-ups know exactly how fast signals like that can become exits. I spent the morning prepping, not because I didn't already know what was wrong, but because I wanted to be exact. I opened every folder I had built over the past few months, revisited the project plans that had been ignored, the timelines that had been skipped, the briefs that had been rewritten into nonsense. I didn't feel nervous. I felt ready, like a storm that had been building finally had somewhere to go. When the call started, all three clients logged on within seconds of each other. Their faces were tight, professional, but I could see the strain. They had all been holding in the same frustration, and now they were letting it surface together. Charles from Polaris started first. He didn't mince words. He said the launch was a mess, that trust had been broken, and that the only reason he hadn't pulled the account already was because of the call I took that night. Then Vanessa from Lark and Thorne echoed him, listing off the mounting errors and how the new point of contact was never prepared. Hawkins followed, blunt as ever, stating that they had already started conversations with another agency and that this meeting was a courtesy, not a negotiation. Then came the ask. They wanted me back. Not just involved, not just copied, but reinstated as the strategic lead. Otherwise, they were prepared to walk. I didn't speak. I didn't need to. I let the CEO sit with it. His mouth opened once, then closed. He promised a response by end of day. When the call ended, I logged off slowly, knowing this wasn't a win yet, but it was the first checkmate move. And they all knew it. The invitation arrived late the night before, just a simple calendar hold titled Follow Up on Client Concerns, but the attendee list told the real story: the CEO, HR, legal, myself. And every lead contact from the three clients who had just delivered an ultimatum. There was no mention of Tessa, There was no mention of anyone from her team. It was the kind of meeting that wasn't about saving face anymore. It was about survival, and they had finally realized that ignoring me was no longer an option. I didn't sleep much that night, but it wasn't out of fear. I went over my files one last time, organized my notes, and laid everything out in order. Not as a weapon, but as evidence. Not to destroy anyone, but to make sure no one could say they didn't know what had really happened. When the meeting began, the energy was stiff and cautious, like everyone was holding their breath. The CEO opened with a statement about company values and continuous improvement, the kind of sterile language that usually introduces a non-apology. But before he could pivot to the clients, I asked if I could speak. There was a beat of hesitation, then a nod. I clicked share screen and opened the first folder. I walked them through every major campaign error, from misdeliverables to misquoted statistics to design drafts that had been rewritten beyond recognition. I kept my voice steady, never once raising it. I didn't speculate. I didn't insult. I simply showed the facts. Time-stamped, documented, cross-referenced with client feedback and internal messages. Every time I paused, I looked directly at the CEO and then at the clients, and I could see it landing. Heads nodded, brows furrowed, no one interrupted. Vanessa asked a question about the Lark and Thorn rollout, and I answered it with a copy of the original brief that had been ignored. Charles requested clarification on the live event sequence, and I pulled up the archived plan I had submitted before being removed from the project. HR scribbled notes. Legal stayed quiet, eyes narrowed, clearly calculating risk. The CEO tried once to redirect the tone, suggesting that everyone had been doing their best. I didn't even flinch. I simply returned to the slides and said, "Here is the version that was approved before the changes, and here is what was sent out." And then I let the silence work for me. It hung there like proof. Not just that I had done the work, but that they had chosen to ignore it. When I finished, I stopped sharing my screen and folded my hands. No final statement, no emotional appeal. Just the truth, laid bare. The clients thanked me directly. One of them even said, "This is the clarity we have been asking for." The CEO nodded slowly, clearly boxed in. HR promised follow-ups. Legal asked for copies of my documentation. I knew then what they all knew too. The narrative had shifted, and for once, I had written it myself. The fallout came faster than I expected, not from the boardroom or the executives, but from the one place Tessa had always counted on to prop her up, her curated online following. 2 days after the meeting, while the internal leadership team scrambled behind closed doors and HR sent out carefully worded statements about restructuring and realignment, Tessa uploaded a video to her public professional page. It was shot in soft lighting, framed to highlight her sleek ponytail and beige aesthetic background, and it opened with a heavy sigh and a watery smile. She spoke for 6 minutes, positioning herself as a victim of workplace toxicity, saying she had been bullied by jealous coworkers who could not accept her success. She never said my name, but she didn't have to. She made vague references to women who had been there longer, who had not adapted to the times, who felt threatened by fresh leadership energy. It was scripted and slippery, exactly the kind of damage control meant to stir sympathy without offering any accountability. For the first hour, the comments were supportive. People thanked her for her vulnerability. A few even called her brave. But then the screenshots started. Quietly at first, then suddenly everywhere. Former interns posted Slack conversations where she had mocked clients behind their backs, mispronounced their names, and asked someone to redo a deck because the brand colors didn't match her outfit for the pitch. Junior designers shared snippets of emails where she demanded last-minute changes without reading the briefs. Someone even reposted the quote from the Polaris disaster, where she had called the client's flagship product boring and outdated. It was all real. I knew because I had seen most of it already. But now the world was seeing it too. By the end of the day, her video had more than 500 comments, most of them turning sharply against her. A trending LinkedIn post titled "When Confidence Outruns Competence" referred to her as a glorified sorority intern with a ring light and a buzzword addiction. Another post simply said, "If this is what leadership looks like, no wonder the clients are leaving." She deleted the video within 12 hours, but the internet never forgets. The story had already taken on a life of its own. People who had never met her, never worked with her, were dissecting every caption she had ever posted, every panel she had ever been on, questioning how someone with so little substance had been elevated so high. I didn't say a word. I didn't comment. I didn't repost. I didn't need to. The truth had been watered, and now it was blooming. She had built her platform on visibility, but when that spotlight turned harsh, there was nowhere for her to hide. For once, she couldn't outtalk the damage. And for the first time, everyone saw what I had known from the beginning. It was never about being threatened by her. It was about being insulted by the lie. It happened without ceremony, no announcement to the company, no farewell email, just a calendar notice that the weekly executive call had a new host and a quiet internal memo confirming the CEO's decision to step down was effective immediately. There were whispers about health reasons, family obligations, time to refocus, all the usual phrases that sound palatable in press releases, but no one believed them. Everyone knew it was the review. After the client meeting and the documentation I provided, the board had launched an internal audit so thorough it made the walls feel thinner. Every skipped protocol, every overlooked complaint, every risk taken in the name of image over substance was laid out in quiet, damning detail. And at the center of it all was the decision to elevate someone based on visibility rather than merit. It wasn't just about Tessa anymore. It was about what her rise represented and what it had cost. I didn't celebrate when the news broke. I didn't smirk or say I told you so. I sat at my desk, opened a blank document, and started outlining a proposal for how the company could move forward. Not just in name, but in principle. 2 days later, I was called into a meeting with the board. There was no preamble. They told me they needed someone who understood both the work and the people, someone who had the trust of the clients, the respect of the team, and the kind of clarity that came from actually doing the job rather than talking about it. They offered me the seat. Not a promotion, not a temporary placeholder. The seat. The one he had held. I asked for time to consider, not because I doubted myself, but because I knew what it meant. Stepping into that role would mean rebuilding a culture that had been chipped away by ego and shortcuts. It would mean re-earning trust that had been fractured. And it would mean leading in a way that felt foreign to the people who had built their success on noise. But when I walked out of that meeting, I already knew my answer. Not out of pride, out of principle. Because you cannot run a company like a stage. You cannot build loyalty with empty titles. And when you let loyalty go, when you dismiss the people who carry the weight quietly, you lose the foundation holding everything up. He had underestimated the quiet ones, the steady ones, the ones who do not need applause to know they are right. And now the board understood what I had always known. Real leadership is not about being seen. It is about seeing clearly. I accepted the seat a week later. No big announcement, no video, just a shift in tone that everyone could feel. And when I sat in that chair for the first time, I did not think about revenge. I thought about legacy, not what you take with you, but what you leave standing when the noise dies down. And mine was still standing. I could have taken it. I could have walked into that corner office with its floor-to-ceiling windows and heavy door that once stayed closed to me and claimed it like some long-overdue prize. I could have sat in his chair and rewritten every policy that had failed me, erased every trace of performative leadership and filled it with something real. But when I stood in that room, looking out over the skyline with the offer on the table and every executive nodding in approval, I realized something I hadn't let myself admit until that moment. I didn't want the job. Not like that. Not as a replacement. Not inside the same machine that had tried to silence me until the silence got too loud. I wanted something that wasn't rooted in damage control or cleanup. I wanted to build, not fix. So I said no, politely, calmly, without bitterness. And then I walked out of the building with nothing in my hands but everything that mattered still intact. Within a week, I registered my own agency. I chose a name that meant something to me, one that honored where I came from and pointed to where I was going. And within 3 weeks of launching, I had 3 signed clients, all of whom had one thing in common. They had sat on that video call and watched me explain what had gone wrong. They had seen the difference between leadership and performance, between strategy and spectacle. They didn't care about office tours or high-rise views. They cared that I showed up, that I listened, that I told them the truth when it mattered. I worked out of a small space above a coffee shop at first, one of those places that smelled like ambition and over-roasted beans, where I could hear the barista humming along to old soul songs while I sketched out campaign frameworks on whiteboards that still had smudges from the last tenant. It wasn't glamorous, it wasn't impressive, but it was mine. And the first hires I made were the 2 interns Tessa had tried to blame when the Polaris launch fell apart. I remembered how they stayed late without being asked, how they panicked when things started slipping and tried to quietly fix what they had no power to control. I brought them on as junior strategists, gave them titles they had earned, and watched their shoulders drop when they realized they were finally being trusted. We didn't have the fanciest tools or the biggest office, but we had ideas and integrity and grit. And every time a new client came through our doors, they came because someone else had told them about the woman who didn't speak until she had something worth saying. I could have stayed where it was safe. I could have worn the title they finally offered, but instead, I chose something better. I chose to start again, and this time, I made sure every single piece of it was built to last. The morning light pours into my office like something earned, not gifted, and I let it soak across the hardwood floors and the framed sketches leaning against the wall, still waiting to be hung. There's a quiet to this space that doesn't exist in the high rises I used to pace, a calm that comes from knowing I built this from the ground up, not because someone finally saw my value, but because I never stopped seeing it myself. My desk is cluttered with campaign drafts and client notes, and a half-empty mug of strong coffee that has long gone cold, but I do not mind. I have always liked things that carry the memory of their purpose. Across from me, the team I chose works with a focus I used to dream about, heads bent over laptops, ideas tossed around like currency that actually means something. We are small, but we are sharp, and word has gotten around. We do not promise more than we can deliver. We do not inflate, embellish, or distract. We listen, we build, and we stay out of the spotlight unless there is something worth showing. And somehow, that has made us the ones people talk about. I hear my name mentioned now in rooms I am not even in, not as a caution or a footnote, but as a recommendation. Meanwhile, the woman who once stood in my place, all teeth and curated charm, has gone quiet. Tessa still tries, I hear. She sends emails to brands she used to name drop. She posts long reflections on failure as a path to growth. She uploads videos about resilience and leadership and making mistakes with grace. But her comments are empty now. Her likes have dried up. People remember the smoke, but they have already forgotten the fire. She tries to book meetings, but no one bites. She reaches out to former contacts, but most do not respond. The few who do reply with vague deferrals or polite no thank yous. Her name has become something people politely skim past, the way you ignore a spam message that almost fooled you once. I do not gloat. I do not need to. The industry is not kind to those who climb fast without learning how to hold on. I sip my coffee and scroll through an onboarding deck for a new client who came through word of mouth. Someone who said, "We heard you're the one who gets it done without the performance." That is all I have ever wanted. Not fame, not applause, just truth and consistency and the right to do my work without being undermined for it. Tessa once tried to stand on the foundation I built, but when you do not understand the weight of what you are standing on, eventually it caves. And now, while I am sitting in the sun, she is out of breath trying to catch up to something she never understood. Quiet revenge is still revenge, and this kind tastes like peace.